Alexander Dubois was the epitome of a successful Parisian executive. At 35, he already held a prominent position at one of France's largest technology companies. His office high up in a skyscraper with a view of the Eiffel Tower was a testament to his status and power. Alexander was known for his sharp intellect, impeccable suit, and arrogant attitude that bordered on disdain for those he deemed inferior. It was during a business trip to a small town in the French countryside that fate decided to play a trick on Alexander. In a charming café in the main square, he met Chateau Laurent. Unlike the sophisticated and ambitious women he was used to associating with in Paris, Jade was a 28-year-old woman, gentle and discreet, with a warm smile and eyes that seemed to hold 1,000 secrets. "Excuse me, is this seat taken?" Alexander asked, more out of habit than genuine interest. Jade looked up from the book she was reading and smiled. "No, please, feel free to sit." Something about that smile made Alexander sit down, momentarily forgetting his usual haste. The conversation flowed with an ease that surprised him. Jade spoke about literature, art, and life in the small town with a passion he rarely encountered in his Parisian circles. "You're not from around here, are you?" Jade asked, noting his refined accent. Alexander laughed, slightly arrogantly. "No, I'm from Paris. I'm here on business. To be honest, I can hardly wait to get back to civilization." Jade raised an eyebrow, but her smile remained. "Ah, Paris. It must be exciting. Here, we lead a simpler life, but there's a beauty in that, don't you think?" Alexander hesitated, torn between his usual disdain for provincial life and an inexplicable desire not to offend Jade. "I suppose so, for those who appreciate that sort of thing." In the days that followed, Alexander found himself looking for reasons to extend his stay. Each meeting with Jade left him more intrigued. She was different from anyone he had ever met, kind, but not weak, intelligent, but not pretentious, beautiful, in a natural way that made the women of Paris seem artificial in comparison. When he finally returned to Paris, Alexander realized that something had changed. Meetings seemed less important, parties less appealing. He found himself thinking about Jade, her smile, her melodious laughter. Against all expectations, Alexander returned to the small town. And he came back again. And again. With each visit, he discovered more about Jade, but curiously, less about her family and her past. She spoke of her parents fondly, but always vaguely. "My parents? Oh, they are simple people, you know. They live a quiet life here," Jade said, deftly steering the conversation away. In his arrogance, Alexander assumed Jade's family must be humble, perhaps even ashamed of their status. This, he thought, would explain Jade's reluctance to talk about them. Far from being an impediment, this only increased his attraction. The idea of being Jade's savior, of elevating her to Parisian high society, fed his ego. 6 months after their first meeting, Alexander proposed to Jade. It was a glamorous affair in Paris, with the crème de la crème of society in attendance. Jade looked stunning in her wedding dress, but Alexander couldn't help but notice a hint of sadness in her eyes when she looked at the empty seats reserved for her family. "They couldn't make it," Jade explained softly. "The trip would be complicated for them." Alexander nodded, convinced that Jade's family probably felt out of place at such an elegant event. "Don't worry, dear. Now you have a new family, one that can give you everything you deserve." Jade's smile faltered for a moment, but Alexander was too busy receiving congratulations to notice. He was sure he had made an excellent deal, a beautiful, kind, and discreet wife who would appreciate everything he could offer. Little did he know that his world was about to be turned upside down. The months following the wedding were a whirlwind of social events, business dinners, and luxurious trips. Alexander was determined to show Jade the best the world had to offer, convinced he was doing his humble wife a favor. However, as time passed, Jade began to mention with increasing frequency her desire to visit her parents in Provence. "Alexander, dear," Jade said one night as they dined in their apartment overlooking the Seine, don't you think it's time we met my parents? They're eager to meet you. Alexander swallowed a sip of wine, trying to hide his hesitation. Jade, you know how busy I am. And frankly, I don't see why we should bother going all the way to, where do they live again? Provence, Alexander. They live in Provence, Jade replied, a hint of irritation in her usually soft voice. And they're your in-laws. It's important to me. Week after week, Jade insisted. Alexander always found an excuse, an important meeting, a client that couldn't wait, an unmissable business trip. But Jade's gentle persistence finally wore down his resistance. All right, Alexander finally relented, exasperated. We'll go this weekend. But don't expect me to stay more than a day. I have important things to do in Paris. Jade's radiant smile almost made him feel guilty for his reluctance. Almost. On the morning of the trip, Alexander was in a foul mood. He imagined a tedious journey to a modest, perhaps even shabby, house and an awkward reception with his in-laws, who would probably be intimidated by his presence. Remember, dear, he said to Jade as they boarded the train, you don't need to be embarrassed if your parents' house is, well, you know. Simple. I understand. Jade merely smiled enigmatically. I'm sure you'll like it, Alexander. The journey was more pleasant than Alexander expected, with the landscape gradually changing from urban areas to the green fields of southern France. When they disembarked at the station, Alexander was surprised to see a smartly dressed chauffeur waiting for them. Welcome back, Mademoiselle Jade, the chauffeur greeted with a warm smile. And you must be Monsieur Dubois. It's a pleasure to meet you. Alexander looked at Jade, confused, but she was already getting into the luxurious car. As they drove along winding roads, Alexander noticed they were climbing a hill, with vineyards stretching as far as the eye could see on both sides. Jade, Alexander began hesitantly, where exactly are we going? To my parents' home, of course, she replied with a serene smile. When the car finally stopped, Alexander was left speechless. Before them stood a magnificent property, an 18th-century Provençal villa surrounded by meticulously maintained gardens and offering a panoramic view of the surrounding vineyards. Welcome to Chateau Laurent, announced the chauffeur, opening the car door. Alexander stepped out of the vehicle in a state of shock. This couldn't be real. He had expected a simple house, perhaps a modest farmhouse, but this was something out of a luxury postcard. Jade, he whispered, incredulous, what is this? Before she could answer, the doors of the villa opened, and an elegant couple emerged to greet them. The man, with graying hair and a commanding presence, wore a casual yet obviously expensive suit. The woman, with the same warm smile as Jade, wore a simple but impeccably tailored dress. My dear, the woman exclaimed, embracing Jade. So good to have you back. Mom, Dad, Jade said, turning to Alexander, this is my husband, Alexander Dubois. Jade's father extended his hand. François Laurent. And this is my wife, Marie. Welcome to our home, Alexander. Alexander shook François' hand mechanically, his mind still struggling to process what he was seeing. The vineyards, the property, the name Laurent. Everything was starting to make sense in a way that left him deeply uncomfortable. Please, come in, Marie invited with an elegant gesture. You must be tired from the journey. We've prepared a light snack before dinner. As they followed their hosts into the sumptuous villa, Alexander shot a look at Jade, a mixture of confusion and accusation in his eyes. She only smiled, a playful gleam in her gaze. Welcome to my childhood home, dear, she whispered, linking her arm with his. I hope you enjoy our simple life in Provence. Alexander swallowed hard, realizing he was about to enter a world for which he was utterly unprepared. The sun was already setting over the vineyards when the family gathered for dinner. The dining room was a display of rustic elegance, with a long solid wood table, crystal chandeliers, and a breathtaking view of the valley through large French windows. Alexander, still stunned by the revelation of Jade's family's true nature, was trying to maintain his usual composure. François Laurent sat at the head of the table, with Marie on his right and Jade on his left. Alexander occupied the seat next to his wife, feeling strangely out of place. "So, Alexander," François began as a maid served the starter, "Jade told us you work in the technology sector in Paris. It must be fascinating." Alexander, seeing an opportunity to regain control of the situation, straightened up in his chair. "Oh, yes," he replied with a smug smile. "I'm an executive director at one of the largest technology companies in France. We work with clients worldwide, you know. It's not something you see much around here, I imagine." Marie exchanged a quick glance with her husband before responding kindly, "Actually, we have several promising technology companies in the region. Innovation is not exclusive to the big cities." Alexander laughed, a forced and condescending sound. Sure. But it's not comparable to the hustle and bustle of Paris, is it? Life here must be so simple." Jade lightly touched her husband's arm, a subtle warning gesture he completely ignored. "Speaking of which," Alexander continued, looking around critically, "this house is quite interesting. A bit antiquated for my taste, but I suppose it matches the local lifestyle." François raised an eyebrow but kept his voice calm. "This property has been in the family for generations. We prefer to preserve its history and character." Alexander waved dismissively. "Ah, yes, tradition. In Paris, we're always looking to the future. But I understand that things change more slowly here." The silence that followed was broken only by the clinking of cutlery. Jade cast an apologetic glance at her parents, who maintained neutral expressions. When the main course was served, a delicious coq au vin, Alexander decided to continue his dissertation on the wonders of Parisian life. "You know," he said between bites, "last week I had dinner with the Minister of Economy. We discussed the future of the French industry. It's the kind of conversation that can really change the world. Here, I imagine the discussions revolve more around the next harvest, right?" Marie delicately placed her fork down. "Actually, Alexander, we have frequent contact with ministers and business leaders. Our vineyard exports to more than 50 countries." Alexander, ignoring the comment, continued, "And the clothes. Don't get me wrong, I appreciate the rustic charm. But in Paris, fashion is taken very seriously. I suppose there's not much need to dress well here." François, wearing a fine linen shirt that probably cost more than Alexander's suit, simply smiled politely. "Every place has its own style, doesn't it?" As dinner progressed, Alexander continued to make disparaging comments about life outside of Paris, seemingly oblivious to the growing discomfort around him. He spoke about the Michelin-starred restaurants he frequented, the celebrities he mingled with, and how provincial life seemed tedious in comparison. Jade tried several times to change the direction of the conversation, but Alexander was on a mission to impress, or, more precisely, to reaffirm his supposed superiority. "You know," he said, turning to François, "if you ever want to modernize things a bit around here, I can recommend some excellent consultants from Paris. I'm sure they could give this place a shake-up, make it more contemporary." François placed his napkin on the table, his patience clearly wearing thin. "I appreciate the offer, Alexander, but we're quite satisfied with our current approach." The dinner finally ended, with a dessert that Alexander barely touched, too busy talking about the famous chefs he knew in Paris. When everyone rose from the table, the air was heavy with palpable tension. Marie and François maintained polite smiles, but their eyes betrayed their disappointment and disapproval. Jade looked mortified, casting apologetic glances at her parents. "Well," François said, "it was an interesting evening. Perhaps it would be best for us to retire. The journey must have been tiring for you." As they climbed the stairs to the guest room, Jade clutched Alexander's arm tightly. "We need to talk," she whispered, her voice tense. But Alexander, pleased with himself, failed to notice the storm brewing in his wife's eyes. The next morning dawned with a gentle mist covering the vineyards. Alexander and Jade descended for breakfast, a tense silence between them. The previous night, Jade had tried to talk to her husband about his behavior at dinner, but Alexander dismissed her concerns, insisting he was just being charming and sociable. François and Marie were already in the dining room when the couple arrived. The air was still heavy with the discomfort of the previous night, but the Laurents maintained their elegant and hospitable demeanor. "Good morning," Marie greeted with a polite smile. "I hope you slept well." Jade smiled back, grateful for her mother's kindness. "We slept very well, thank you. The view from the room is wonderful." Alexander, still oblivious to the tension he had created, sat at the table with a nonchalant air. "The mattress is a bit too soft for my liking. In Paris, we have a state-of-the-art orthopedic bed. It makes all the difference, you know." Jade closed her eyes for a moment, taking a deep breath. "Alexander, dear, I'm sure Mom and Dad would be happy to arrange a different mattress if you need one." François intervened gently. "Actually, those mattresses are custom-made by a local craftsman. They are quite sought after by luxury hotels across Europe." Alexander shrugged, serving himself some croissants. "If you say so. I suppose it's the best one can get around here." Trying to change the direction of the conversation, Jade turned to her father. "Dad, I thought we could show Alexander the vineyards today. I'm sure he'll be impressed with the estate." "Excellent idea," François agreed. "After breakfast, we can take a tour. Alexander, do you enjoy wines?" Before Alexander could respond, one of the staff members entered the room carrying a bottle of red wine. "Ah, perfect," said François. "I thought of opening a special bottle to celebrate your visit. It's a Laurent family tradition to start the day with a little tasting." The staff member poured a small amount into crystal glasses for each of them. Alexander looked at the ruby liquid with skepticism. "Wine in the morning? Well, I suppose it's the local customs," he commented with a condescending smile. Jade, sensing the need to intervene, tried to steer the conversation to safer ground. "Alexander, you'll love it. My family's winery is truly special." Alexander brought the glass to his nose, taking a superficial sniff before quickly taking a sip. His face contorted into a barely disguised expression of distaste. Interesting," he said, placing the glass back on the table. "A bit rustic for my palate. In Paris, we're used to more refined wines, you know. Maybe I could recommend some producers that could help improve the quality here." The ensuing silence was deafening. François and Marie exchanged incredulous looks, while Jade seemed to want to disappear into her chair. François cleared his throat before speaking, his voice controlled but with a hint of irritation. "Alexander, the wine you just tasted is a Chateau Laurent 1982. It is considered one of the rarest and most valuable vintages in France. A single bottle can fetch over 5,000 euros at international auctions." Alexander blinked, momentarily at a loss for words. Jade seized the opportunity to try to salvage the situation. "What Dad means is that this wine is very special. It's one of the family's prides," she explained gently. "Perhaps you could try it again, more calmly this time." Reluctantly, Alexander picked up the glass again, this time taking a slower, more considered sip. His eyes widened slightly as he realized the complexity and depth of flavor he had ignored in his first rushed tasting. "Well," he said, clearly trying to maintain his composure, "I suppose it's adequate. Of course, it doesn't compare to the Grand Crus we usually drink in Paris, but for a local production, it's acceptable." Marie, who had remained silent until now, spoke with a calmness that barely concealed her irritation. "In fact, Alexander, our wines are regularly awarded in international competitions and are served in some of the world's finest restaurants, including several in Paris. The rest of breakfast proceeded in uncomfortable silence, punctuated only by Jade's occasional attempts to start light conversation. Alexander, for the first time since his arrival, seemed slightly out of his depth, although his arrogance still prevented him from fully acknowledging his mistake. When they finished, Francois stood up. "Well, if you're ready, we can begin our tour of the vineyards. Perhaps it will help expand your horizons, Alexander." As they left the dining room, Jade held Alexander's arm, whispering urgently, "Please try to be more open and respectful. This is my family, and their heritage is important to me." Alexander nodded distractedly, still processing the fact that perhaps, just perhaps, he had gravely underestimated the Laurent family. The morning was clear and fresh when François Laurent invited Alexander for a tour of the property. Jade, sensing that her father wanted a private conversation with her husband, chose to stay at the house with her mother. "Come, Alexander," François said with an enigmatic smile. "Let me show you what we really do here." Alexander, still somewhat unsettled by the previous day's events, followed his father-in-law in silence. They started walking through the vineyards that stretched as far as the eye could see. "These vineyards," François began, "have been in the Laurent family for over 300 years. Each generation adds something new, but always maintaining the tradition and quality that have made us famous." Alexander looked around, beginning to grasp the vastness of the property. "Famous? You mean, locally?" François laughed softly. "Alexander, let me be straightforward. Laurent Vineyards is one of the most prestigious in France. Our exports reach over 80 countries. Last year, our revenue exceeded 500 million euros. Alexander stopped abruptly, his eyes wide with surprise. 500 million. But, how? Quality, tradition, and innovation, François answered simply. He pointed to a nearby hill. "Do you see that modern building? It's our enological research center. We have partnerships with leading universities worldwide. We're always looking for ways to improve our wines while respecting traditional methods." They continued walking, passing teams of workers who greeted François with evident respect. Alexander noticed that many of them wore uniforms with the Laurent Vineyards logo. "How many employees do you have?" Alexander asked, his voice now tinged with genuine interest. "During the peak season, we have over 1,000 direct employees," François replied. "Not counting the indirect ones and partner companies." They reached an imposing building that Alexander hadn't noticed before. "This is our visitor center," François explained. "We receive over 100,000 tourists a year. We have restaurants, a wine museum, tasting rooms." Alexander looked wide-eyed at the modern and elegant structure. "This is impressive," he admitted, his usual arrogance giving way to a reluctant admiration. François smiled, noting the change in his son-in-law's tone. "Let's go inside. I want to show you something." Inside the building, they walked through a gallery of historical photos and international awards. François stopped in front of a particularly impressive showcase. "This," he said, pointing to a dusty bottle, "is a Laurent 1811. It's considered one of the best wines ever produced in history. There are only 3 known bottles in the world. One is here, another is at Buckingham Palace, and the third was auctioned last year for 230,000 euros. Alexander swallowed hard, finally comprehending the magnitude of what he was seeing. "I had no idea," he murmured. François placed a hand on Alexander's shoulder. "Alexander, I know you're used to the corporate world of Paris. It's an impressive world, no doubt. But here, we've built something that transcends generations. It's not just a business, it's a legacy." They continued the tour, passing through the cellar where thousands of oak barrels aged the precious wine, through the state-of-the-art laboratory where enologists tested new blends, and finally arriving at an elegant office overlooking the vineyards. "This is my office," François said, sitting behind an antique mahogany desk. "From here, I manage not only the vineyard but also our other ventures. Other ventures? Alexander asked, his curiosity now fully piqued. François smiled. Laurent Vineyards is just one part of our business. We have investments in luxury hotels, a line of gourmet products, and even some tech startups in Marseille and Lyon. Alexander sat down, feeling suddenly small. All his boasting about his position in Paris now seemed terribly inadequate. François, he began hesitantly, I don't know what to say. Clearly, I underestimated. François raised a hand, gently interrupting him. Alexander, I'm not showing you this to impress you or make you feel bad. I'm showing it because you're part of the family now. And in the Laurent family, we value two things above all, respect and humility. Alexander nodded slowly, his father-in-law's words resonating deeply. For the first time since arriving in Provence, he felt genuinely humbled. Alexander and François returned to the main house after the revealing tour of the property. The Parisian executive was visibly shaken, his usually confident demeanor replaced by a mix of surprise and discomfort. Upon entering the living room, they found Jade and Marie conversing quietly. Jade immediately noticed the change in her husband's expression. Alexander? Is everything okay? Alexander opened his mouth to respond, but the words seemed to elude him. François intervened gently, we had a very enlightening conversation. Marie stood up, offering a polite but cautious smile. I hope you enjoyed the tour, Alexander. Our property has a long history. Alexander cleared his throat, feeling the weight of the gazes upon him. Yes, it was impressive. I had no idea about the extent of your business. An uncomfortable silence hung in the air. Jade cast an inquisitive look at her father, who replied with a slight nod. Alexander, Jade began softly, perhaps now you understand why I wanted you to meet my family and see our home. The executive nodded mechanically, still processing everything he had discovered. His mind raced, replaying all the disparaging comments he had made in the past few days, each arrogant observation now seeming even more out of place in light of the revelations. I must. Alexander began, his voice trembling slightly. I think I owe some apologies. François and Marie exchanged glances, their expressions a mix of hope and skepticism. Alexander continued, struggling to find the right words, clearly, I underestimated the importance and reach of your business. It was a lapse in judgment on my part. Jade gently touched her husband's arm, encouraging him to continue. However, Alexander's old arrogance began to resurface, as a defense mechanism against his own shame. Of course, he added, his tone becoming more confident, if I had been properly informed about the true nature of your situation, I would have acted differently. In Paris, we're used to dealing with big businesses, so naturally, I assumed. François raised a hand, gently interrupting his son-in-law. Alexander, it's not about business size or wealth. It's about respect, humility, and the ability to value people and their stories, regardless of their possessions. Marie added, her voice calm but firm, we'd like to think we've raised our daughter to value those qualities above any material success. Alexander felt the weight of disappointment in his in-law's eyes. He looked to Jade for support, but found only a look of sadness in her face. I understand, Alexander said, though his tone suggested otherwise. Perhaps I was a bit hasty in my observations. But you have to understand, in my world. Alexander, Jade interrupted softly, please. The executive paused, realizing too late that he was digging himself into an even deeper hole. He took a deep breath, trying to compose himself. I apologize, he finally said, though the words sounded more like a formality than a sincere admission. It wasn't my intention to offend. François and Marie maintained dignified and reserved postures, their faces masks of polite neutrality. It was evident that Alexander's words, though a step in the right direction, were not enough to erase the negative impression he had created. We appreciate your attempt to apologize, Alexander, François said finally. We hope that this visit has been educational for you. Marie nodded, adding with forced kindness, perhaps, in time, we can all look back and laugh at this initial misunderstanding. The rest of the afternoon passed in an atmosphere of tense courtesy. Alexander, unaccustomed to feeling inferior or ashamed, alternated between awkward attempts at redemption and moments of uncomfortable silence. Jade watched her husband with a mix of disappointment and concern, wondering if he could overcome his arrogance and truly learn from this experience. As the sun began to set over the vineyards, casting long shadows across the property, it became clear to everyone that this visit had irrevocably changed the family dynamics. The future of the relationship between Alexander and the Laurents remained uncertain, hanging like an unanswered question in the air of Provence. The train sped through the French countryside, taking Alexander and Jade back to Paris. The silence between them was palpable, laden with unresolved tension and unspoken words. Jade looked out the window, her reflection in the glass revealing an expression of deep sadness and disappointment. Finally, she turned to Alexander, her voice calm but firm. "We need to talk about what happened this weekend." Alexander sighed, adjusting his tie as if preparing for a difficult negotiation. "Jade, dear, I've already apologized. What more do you want me to do?" "Apologizing isn't enough, Alexander," Jade replied, her eyes fixed on his. "You insulted my family, belittled our lifestyle, and acted with an arrogance I've never seen before." Alexander frowned, his defensive stance immediately visible. "Look, I admit I made some judgment errors. But you have to understand, I didn't know about your family's business empire. If you had told me..." "It's not about money or status, Alexander." Jade interrupted, her voice rising slightly. "It's about respect, humility, and the ability to value people for who they are, not what they have." Alexander shook his head, his arrogance still evident. "In the business world, Jade, status and connections are everything. I acted based on the information I had. And does that justify treating people with disdain?" Jade asked incredulously. "Even if my parents were truly simple and humble people, that wouldn't give you the right to act the way you did." The train continued its journey, the landscape changing rapidly outside, a contrast to the stagnation of the conversation inside the compartment. "Look," Alexander said, his voice taking on a condescending tone, "maybe I was a little rude. But you have to admit the situation was unusual. In Paris." "Paris, Paris, Paris," Jade exclaimed, exasperated. "The world doesn't revolve around Paris, Alexander. And it certainly doesn't revolve around your ego." The rest of the journey passed in tense silence, punctuated only by Alexander's failed attempts to justify his behavior and Jade's refusal to accept his hollow apologies. When they finally reached their apartment in Paris, the atmosphere was charged with a sense of finality. Jade walked straight to the bedroom, leaving Alexander confused in the living room. Minutes later, she reappeared with a suitcase. Alexander looked at her, perplexed. "What are you doing?" Jade placed the suitcase on the floor, her eyes meeting Alexander's with a mix of sadness and determination. "I can't continue with this marriage, Alexander." "What?" Alexander exclaimed, shocked. "Jade, you can't be serious. Because of a misunderstanding?" "It's not just a misunderstanding," Jade replied, her voice trembling slightly. "It's a pattern of behavior, a mindset I can no longer tolerate. You showed who you really are this weekend, Alexander, and it's not someone I want to spend the rest of my life with." Alexander, for the first time, seemed genuinely shaken. "Jade, please, we can talk about this. I can change, I promise." Jade shook her head sadly. "Words, Alexander. All you have are words. Your actions show otherwise. I need time to think, to reassess everything." With that, she picked up her suitcase and walked toward the door. Alexander, still in shock, couldn't move to stop her. "Where are you going?" he asked, his voice almost a whisper. "Home," Jade replied simply. To Provence. The door closed behind her with a soft click, leaving Alexander alone in the vast, luxurious apartment. He looked around, seeing for the first time the emptiness behind the material splendor. Slowly, Alexander walked to the window, looking out at the city he had so highly valued. Paris stretched out before him, beautiful and imposing as always, but now it seemed cold and distant. In that moment, facing the consequences of his arrogance and prejudice, Alexander began to understand the true cost of his attitude. The luxurious apartment, the expensive cars, the status in Paris, all of it seemed hollow without Jade, without the love and respect he had so carelessly thrown away. Night fell over Paris, and Alexander remained motionless, contemplating the uncertain future his arrogance had created.